In the vast plains of Wyoming, beneath endless skies that stretch toward tomorrow, a wealthy cattleman named Clayton McKenzie has everything money can buy, except the one thing his heart truly needs. For 3 years, he's traveled from town to town with a carefully written list of what makes the perfect bride: beautiful, refined, accomplished, and from good family stock. He's courted debutantes and socialites, each meeting ending the same way, with polite conversation and hollow promises that never fill the emptiness in his chest. At 35, Clayton is beginning to wonder if love is just another commodity that can't be purchased with gold. Then in the small town of Harmony Creek, he encounters Sarah Beth Williams, a woman who doesn't meet a single item on his list, but possesses something far more valuable. Will this chance meeting teach him that sometimes what we think we want isn't what our hearts actually need? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The McKenzie Ranch, stretched across 20,000 acres of Wyoming's finest grassland, a testament to 4 generations of careful stewardship and shrewd business sense. From the wraparound porch of the grand Victorian house his great-grandfather had built in 1882, Clayton McKenzie could see his prize Angus cattle dotting the rolling hills like dark jewels against the golden autumn grass. The sight should have filled him with pride, as it always had before. Instead, this morning it only emphasized the hollow echo of his footsteps through rooms that seemed to grow larger and emptier with each passing day. Clayton fingered the worn leather portfolio in his lap, its contents more familiar to him than the balance sheets that had made him one of the wealthiest ranchers in the territory. Inside, written in his careful script on cream-colored paper, was his list: 15 carefully considered qualities that would make the perfect wife for a man of his standing. Beautiful, naturally, but not vainly so. Educated, but not so much as to overshadow her husband, from good family stock with impeccable breeding, accomplished in the domestic arts, devout but not overly pious, young enough to bear children, but mature enough to handle the responsibilities of running a household staff. The list had seemed perfectly reasonable when he'd composed it 3 years ago, following his mother's increasingly urgent letters about the need to secure the family line. At 35, he was certainly past the age when most men of his station took wives. His younger brother had died in a riding accident 5 years prior, making Clayton the sole heir to not just the ranch, but to the McKenzie name itself. The weight of that responsibility had pressed upon him like a stone in his chest, growing heavier with each failed courtship. "You're brooding again, boy." The gravelly voice of Pete Hawkins, his foreman for the past 15 years, interrupted his melancholy thoughts. The older man climbed the porch steps with the careful gait of someone whose knees had absorbed a lifetime of hard riding and harsh winters. His weathered face, mapped with lines that spoke of countless hours under the Wyoming sun, wore an expression of patient concern that had become all too familiar. "I'm contemplating, Pete. There's a difference." Clayton closed the portfolio and set it aside, though his fingers lingered on the leather binding. "A man in my position must consider his choices carefully." Pete lowered himself into the chair beside Clayton with a grunt that spoke of arthritic joints and old injuries. "Considering. And fretting ain't the same thing either, and you've been doing plenty of both lately." He pulled out his worn pipe and tobacco pouch, the ritual as much a part of their evening conversations as the setting sun. "Got another letter from your mother today. She's mighty insistent about that Denver gal." The Denver gal was Miss Victoria Ashford, daughter of railroad magnate Jonathan Ashford, whose family had made their fortune connecting the East to the growing West. She was, by all accounts, everything on Clayton's list and more. Photographs showed a delicate beauty with perfectly arranged golden hair and fine features that spoke of generations of careful breeding. Her education at the finest Eastern finishing schools was well documented, as were her accomplishments in music, French, and the social graces expected of a woman of her station. "Miss Ashford is eminently suitable," Clayton said, the words tasting like dust in his mouth. "Mother has made that abundantly clear in her correspondence." Suitable. Pete struck a match and held it to his pipe bowl, drawing slowly until the tobacco caught. "Funny how that word keeps coming up when you talk about these ladies. Heard you use it about Miss Pemberton from Cheyenne, and that banker's daughter from Laramie, too." Clayton shifted uncomfortably. Miss Pemberton had indeed been suitable, the daughter of a prominent merchant family with impeccable manners and a dowry that would have complemented the ranch's holdings nicely. Their 3 formal meetings had proceeded exactly as such encounters should, with proper conversation about mutual acquaintances and shared interests in literature and music. She had smiled at the appropriate moments, laughed softly at his carefully prepared witticisms, and accepted his small gifts with gracious acknowledgement. When he'd failed to make a formal proposal after their 3rd meeting, her parents had politely inquired about his intentions. Unable to provide a satisfactory answer even to himself, Clayton had withdrawn his suit with appropriate apologies and a generous contribution to Miss Pemberton's favorite charity. The banker's daughter from Laramie had been even more suitable if such a thing were possible. Miss Catherine Holbrook possessed not only beauty and refinement, but also a keen understanding of financial matters that would have served the ranch's interests well. Their courtship had lasted 6 weeks of carefully chaperoned meetings, formal dinners, and proper correspondence. She had checked every item on his list with mathematical precision. Yet when the moment came to ask for her hand, Clayton had found himself staring at her perfectly arranged features and feeling nothing more than polite admiration. "I failed to see the problem with seeking a suitable wife," Clayton said, hearing the defensiveness in his own voice. "Marriage, for people in our position, is a matter of complementary assets and shared values. Romance is a luxury that leads to poor decisions." Pete's eyes crinkled with what might have been amusement, though he was wise enough not to let it show in his voice. "Your daddy ever tell you about how he met your mother?" "Dozens of times." Clayton's voice softened despite himself. "They were introduced at a church social in Denver. Father said he knew within an hour that she was the woman he'd marry." "And was she suitable?" Clayton considered this. His mother, Margaret Mackenzie, had indeed been eminently suitable when his father courted her in 1855. The daughter of a successful merchant family with connections throughout the territory, she possessed all the qualities a rancher's wife should have. But that wasn't what his father remembered about their first meeting. Thomas Mackenzie had spoken of his wife's quick wit, the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, and how she'd challenged him to defend his opinions about everything from cattle breeds to political candidates. Their marriage had been a partnership in every sense, with Margaret proving as capable of managing the household staff as she was of advising her husband on business matters. Father said she was spirited, Clayton admitted. Not what he'd expected to find in a merchant's daughter. "Spirited don't appear on that list of yours, does it, boy?" Before Clayton could respond, Pete rose from his chair with another grunt. "Well, I'll leave you to your contemplating. Just remember, your daddy didn't go looking for suitable. He went looking for the right woman, and suitable just happened to be part of the package." The older man paused at the top of the porch steps. "You heading out tomorrow for that last town on your list?" "Harmony Creek." Clayton nodded. "It's a small place, but the territorial governor's wife recommended a family there. The Whitworths, I believe. Their daughter recently returned from school back east. Harmony Creek's a fair piece from here. Pretty country, though. Used to drive cattle through there back in my younger days." Pete's expression grew thoughtful. Quiet town, the kind of place where folks know each other's business but mind their own manners about it. After Pete disappeared into the barn to check on the horses, Clayton remained on the porch as darkness settled over the ranch. The familiar sounds of evening, cattle lowing in the distance, the creak of the windmill, the rustle of nightbirds settling in the cottonwoods usually brought him peace. Tonight, they only emphasized his solitude. He opened the portfolio again and studied his list by lamplight. Each item had been carefully considered, based on observations of successful marriages among his social circle and the advice of well-meaning friends and family. A man of his station needed a wife who could manage a household, entertain guests appropriately, and bear children who would carry on the family name with honor. Love, his more practical friends reminded him, was something that grew between compatible people over time. Passion faded, but shared values and mutual respect endured. Yet as Clayton read through his 15 carefully itemized requirements, he couldn't shake the memory of his parents' marriage. There had been love there, certainly, but also something more, a spark of recognition, a sense of having found not just a suitable partner, but the right partner. His father had often said that marrying Margaret was the smartest business decision he'd ever made, not because of her dowry or family connections, but because she made him a better man. Clayton folded the list and tucked it back into the portfolio. Tomorrow, he would ride to Harmony Creek and meet Miss Elizabeth Whitworth, who was, according to the territorial governor's wife, the most accomplished young lady in the territory. She spoke 3 languages, played piano with professional skill, and had received the highest marks in her finishing school class. Her photograph showed a classically beautiful young woman with dark hair and serious eyes that suggested both intelligence and proper breeding. She would, he was certain, be entirely suitable. The thought should have brought him satisfaction. Instead, as he prepared for bed in the echoing silence of the big house, Clayton found himself wondering if suitable would ever be enough to fill the emptiness that no amount of success or wealth seemed able to touch. Outside his bedroom window, the Wyoming wind whispered through the grass with a lonesome sound that matched the ache in his chest. Tomorrow would bring another town, another introduction, another opportunity to find the wife his position demanded. Yet, for the first time since beginning his methodical search, Clayton McKenzie found himself hoping for something more than mere suitability, though he couldn't have said exactly what that something might be. The town of Harmony Creek nestled in a valley between 2 gentle hills like a child's toy village, its white-painted buildings and tree-lined streets speaking of prosperity without ostentation. Clayton guided his horse down the main thoroughfare, noting the well-maintained storefronts and the careful attention to detail that marked a community that took pride in itself. The October afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden sidewalks, where a few townspeople went about their business with the unhurried pace of those whose lives followed the rhythms of seasons rather than clocks. The Whitworth residence stood on Elm Street, a 2-story colonial with green shutters and a garden that even in autumn showed signs of careful tending. Clayton checked his pocket watch. Precisely 3 o'clock, as arranged in his correspondence with Mr. Jeremiah Whitworth, president of the town's only bank. Punctuality, he'd learned over 3 years of formal courtships, was essential to making the proper impression. Mrs. Constance Whitworth received him in a parlor decorated with tasteful furniture and carefully arranged flowers that spoke of refinement without extravagance. She was a woman of perhaps 50, with graying hair styled in the latest fashion and intelligent eyes that sized up visitors with practiced efficiency. Her daughter, Elizabeth, sat beside her on a velvet settee, hands folded primately in her lap. The very picture of young womanhood, perfectly prepared for inspection. Miss Elizabeth Whitworth was indeed everything her photograph had promised. Dark hair arranged in fashionable curls, framed features that would have graced a cameo, high cheekbones, a straight nose, and lips curved in a pleasant smile that reached her eyes with what appeared to be genuine warmth. Her dress, a deep blue, silk that complemented her coloring, had clearly come from an expensive dressmaker and fit her slender figure to perfection. When she spoke, her voice carried the careful diction of her Eastern education, each word precisely formed and appropriately modulated. "Mr. Mackenzie, we're so delighted you could visit our little town," she said, offering her hand with exactly the right degree of formality. "Mother and I have heard such wonderful things about your ranch from Mrs. Patterson." The conversation proceeded exactly as Clayton had come to expect from such meetings. They discussed the weather, found mutual acquaintances through their respective social circles, and touched upon safe topics like literature and music. Miss Whitworth had indeed read the classics, could discuss the merits of various composers with intelligence, and demonstrated a knowledge of current events that suggested both education and proper interest in the world beyond domestic concerns. "I've been reading Tennyson's latest collection," she mentioned during a discussion of poetry. "His treatment of romantic themes shows such elevated sentiment, don't you think? Though I confess, I sometimes find his language rather dense for casual reading." Clayton nodded appropriately, though he found himself mentally checking off items on his list rather than engaging deeply with her observations. Beautiful, certainly. Well-educated, obviously. From good family, the Whitworth name was well respected throughout the territory. Accomplished, her piano playing, demonstrated at her mother's gentle insistence, was indeed professional in quality. Yet as the afternoon wore on, Clayton found his attention wandering. Through the parlor window, he could see the town's main street, and something about the peaceful scene drew his gaze repeatedly. It was during one of these distracted moments that he noticed a young woman emerge from a building across the street, her arms full of books that she struggled to balance while managing what appeared to be a walking stick. "Oh, that's just the librarian," Mrs. Whitworth said, following his gaze with a slight frown. "Sarah Beth Williams. Such a pity about her condition, but she does manage the library quite competently. Her late aunt left her a small inheritance, you know, just enough to keep her independent. A blessing, really, since—" Mrs. Whitworth's voice trailed off, with the particular delicacy reserved for discussing unfortunate circumstances that polite society preferred not to examine too closely. Clayton watched as the young woman, Sarah Beth, paused to shift her burden of books. Her movements careful, but determined. Something about her caught his attention in a way that had nothing to do with the mental checklist that had governed his romantic endeavors for the past 3 years. "Perhaps we should continue our conversation over tea," Elizabeth suggested, her voice containing just the right note of gentle guidance to move the afternoon along its expected course. The tea service proceeded with all the ritualistic precision Clayton had experienced in a dozen similar parlors across the territory. Delicate china cups, perfectly prepared refreshments, conversation that touched upon approved topics with appropriate depth, but never ventured into anything that might be considered controversial or overly personal. Elizabeth proved herself an accomplished hostess, managing the social requirements with grace while demonstrating her suitability as a wife for a man of substantial position. "I do hope you'll have the opportunity to see more of our little town during your visit," Elizabeth said as the afternoon drew toward its close. "Father would be delighted to show you our bank, and there are several local businessmen who would consider it an honor to make your acquaintance." Clayton assured her that he would indeed welcome such introductions, though even as he spoke the words, he found his gaze drifting again toward the window. The librarian had returned, this time without her burden of books, and was sweeping the wooden steps in front of what he now realized must be the town library. Her movements were economical and purposeful, and despite the walking stick, she managed the task with evident competence. "The library," he said suddenly, interrupting Elizabeth's description of the town's annual harvest festival. "I confess I have something of a weakness for books. Perhaps I might visit before I leave town?" Mrs. Whitworth's eyebrows rose slightly at this deviation from the expected script. "Oh, certainly, though I'm not sure Miss Williams keeps it open much past 4 o'clock. She lives in the rooms above, you know, since her aunt passed. Quite adequate for someone in her circumstances." There was that delicate pause again, the one that encompassed whole conversations about things that weren't quite proper to discuss directly. Clayton found himself curious about those circumstances in a way that surprised him. During 3 years of formal courtships, He'd never found himself wondering about anyone beyond the immediate circle of potential brides and their families. "I believe I have time for a brief visit," he said, rising from his chair with perhaps more enthusiasm than the occasion warranted. "Miss Whitworth, thank you for a most pleasant afternoon. Mrs. Whitworth, your hospitality has been exemplary." Proper farewells were exchanged, with invitations extended for dinner the following evening and promises to consider the various social introductions that had been offered. Elizabeth walked him to the door, her manner suggesting exactly the right balance of interest and propriety that would encourage a serious suitor while maintaining appropriate decorum. "I do hope we'll have the opportunity to continue our conversation tomorrow evening," she said, offering her hand in farewell. "There's so much more I'd like to learn about ranch life and your experiences in the cattle business," Clayton assured her that he looked forward to their next meeting, though as he descended the Whitworth front steps, he found his thoughts already turning toward the small building across the street. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of what was clearly the town library, casting warm rectangles of light across books that lined shelves from floor to ceiling. Something about that light, and the quiet promise of knowledge and stories contained within those walls, called to him in a way that the perfectly appointed Whitworth parlor had not. For the first time in 3 years of methodical courtship, Clayton McKenzie found himself genuinely curious about something or someone who didn't appear anywhere on his carefully compiled list. The walking stick leaning against the library's front door frame suggested that the librarian was indeed still inside. Clayton paused on the wooden sidewalk, his hand resting on the brass door handle, and realized that his heart was beating with an anticipation he hadn't felt since he couldn't remember when. When he stepped through the library door, the small bell above it announcing his arrival with a cheerful chime, Clayton had no idea that his carefully ordered world was about to be turned completely upside down. The interior of the Harmony Creek Library embraced Clayton like a favorite coat, all warm wood and the distinctive scent of aged paper that spoke of countless stories waiting to be discovered. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with volumes that ranged from leather-bound classics to newer publications, whose bright spines suggested recent acquisitions. Afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits celebrating the sanctuary of knowledge. "Good afternoon. May I help you find something?" The voice that greeted him was warm honey, over steel, melodious and welcoming, yet with an underlying strength that suggested its owner was accustomed to standing her ground when necessary. Clayton turned toward the sound and found himself looking into the most remarkable pair of eyes he'd ever encountered. They were hazel, shifting between green and gold depending on how the light caught them, and framed by wire-rimmed spectacles that somehow made them appear even more luminous. Sarah Beth Williams stood behind a mahogany desk that had clearly seen decades of faithful service, her hands resting lightly on an open ledger where she'd been recording what appeared to be book returns. She was younger than he'd expected from his distant glimpses through the Whitworth parlor window, perhaps 25 or 26, with auburn hair pinned back in a practical style that revealed the elegant line of her neck. Her dress was simple blue calico, well-made, but clearly chosen for serviceability rather than fashion, and she wore it with an unconscious grace that no amount of expensive tailoring could duplicate. "I was hoping to browse, if that's acceptable," Clayton managed, suddenly feeling as tongue-tied as a schoolboy facing his first teacher. "I have something of a weakness for books, a weakness I'm delighted to enable," she replied, and he caught the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Are you looking for anything in particular, or would you prefer to explore on your own? We have an excellent collection of Western literature, though I confess our poetry section is my personal pride." As she spoke, Clayton noticed the walking stick propped against her desk, a sturdy piece of carved oak that had been worn smooth by years of use. When she moved from behind the desk to gesture toward the poetry shelves, he saw that she favored her left leg, her gait careful but determined. There was nothing self-conscious about her movement. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had long ago made peace with her limitations. Poetry, you say? Clayton found his voice steadying as genuine interest replaced his initial nervousness. I confess I don't read as much verse as I should. My education focused more on practical matters, cattle breeding, land management, business correspondence. Ah, a rancher then. Sarah Beth's eyes lit with what appeared to be genuine curiosity rather than the calculated interest he'd grown accustomed to from potential brides. You must be Mr. Mackenzie. Word travels quickly in a town this size, and a visit from someone of your prominence generates considerable discussion. There was something in her tone, not quite amusement, but a gentle acknowledgement of the absurdity of small-town gossip that put him at ease in a way he hadn't expected. Most women of his acquaintance either fawned over his wealth and status or treated him with the careful deference due a potential patron. Sarah Beth Williams seemed to regard him simply as another patron of her library, deserving of courtesy, but not of special treatment. Word travels quickly indeed, he agreed, though I hope not unfavorably. On the contrary, the consensus seems to be that you're quite the catch. She said it with such deadpan delivery that he couldn't tell whether she was teasing him or simply stating the obvious. The Whitworth family is particularly pleased with your visit, I understand. Clayton felt heat creep up his neck. The directness of her observation caught him off guard, though not unpleasantly. Miss Whitworth is very accomplished, he said. And carefully, indeed she is. Elizabeth has always been everything a young lady of her station should be. Sarah Beth moved toward the poetry section with her careful gait, running her fingers along the spines of the books with obvious affection. Perfectly educated, perfectly mannered, perfectly suitable for a man seeking a wife to complement his social position. The word perfectly seemed to hang in the air between them, and Clayton found himself studying Sarah Beth's profile as she selected a volume from the shelf. There was something about the way she'd said it, not with malice, but with a kind of resigned understanding that suggested she was well aware of her place in the social hierarchy of Harmony Creek. You seem to know Miss Whitworth well, he said, accepting the book she handed him, a collection of Wordsworth that fell open naturally to pages that had clearly been read many times. We grew up together, though our paths diverged considerably. After childhood, Sarah Beth's voice held no bitterness, only a matter-of-fact acceptance of circumstances. Elizabeth was sent east for finishing school, while I remained here to care for my aunt. Different destinies for different stations in life. Clayton found himself studying her face as she spoke, noting the intelligence that sparked in her eyes, and the way her features, while not conventionally beautiful in the porcelain doll manner currently fashionable, possessed a vitality that made them far more interesting than mere prettiness. When she smiled, and she did so easily, he noticed, her entire countenance transformed with genuine warmth. "Your aunt raised you?" he asked, genuinely curious about her background in a way that surprised him. "After my parents died when I was 12. Aunt Minerva was the town's previous librarian, and she believed that education was the great equalizer, that a well-stocked mind could overcome almost any limitation." Sarah Beth's hand moved unconsciously to her walking stick, and Clayton realized she was speaking as much about her physical condition as her social circumstances. "She left me this library, and enough to maintain it, along with a small inheritance. It's not wealth, but it's independence." The way she said independence suggested it was something she valued more than comfort or social position. Clayton found this perspective fascinating, having never encountered a woman who spoke of self-sufficiency as a goal rather than a temporary necessity to be remedied by marriage. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," he said. She was. Aunt Minerva believed that books could transport you anywhere, make you anyone, teach you anything worth knowing. Sarah Beth gestured around the library with obvious pride. She used to say that between these walls, a person's circumstances mattered less than their curiosity. Clayton looked around the library with new eyes, seeing not just a collection of books, but a sanctuary where the usual rules of society might be temporarily suspended. A democratic institution, then. Exactly. Sarah Beth's smile was radiant. Here, a rancher and a librarian can discuss poetry as equals, and both might learn something they didn't expect. As if to prove her point, she began discussing the Wordsworth collection with an insight that revealed not just education but genuine passion for the subject. Clayton found himself drawn into a conversation about nature poetry that was unlike any literary discussion he'd experienced in the refined parlors of potential brides. Sarah Beth didn't simply demonstrate her knowledge. She shared her genuine enthusiasm, asking his opinions and responding to his thoughts as if they mattered. When the library's clock chimed 5 o'clock, Clayton was startled to realize he'd been there for over an hour. Clayton found himself returning to the library the following morning with an excuse so transparent he felt foolish even as he rehearsed it. He needed recommendations for books about Wyoming's territorial history, he would say, research for improving his ranch's operations. The truth was far simpler and infinitely more complicated. He couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Sarah Beth Williams. The dinner at the Whitworth home the previous evening had proceeded exactly as expected. Elizabeth had been charming, accomplished, and perfectly suitable in every conceivable way. She'd played piano with technical precision, conversed intelligently about topics appropriate to mixed company, and demonstrated exactly the kind of social grace that would complement a man of his station. Yet throughout the evening, Clayton had found his thoughts drifting to a simple library and a woman whose passion for poetry had illuminated her entire being. "Back so soon, Mr. Mackenzie?" Sarah Beth's voice held a note of gentle teasing as he entered the library. "I hope yesterday's poetry didn't prove too overwhelming." She was cataloguing new arrivals, her movements efficient despite the walking stick that never left her side. This morning she wore a dress of soft green wool that brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes, and her hair was arranged in a looser style that framed her face more softly. Clayton found himself noticing these details with an attention that would have alarmed him had he paused to consider it. "Actually, I was hoping you might recommend something about local history," he said, producing his carefully prepared excuse. "I'm always looking for ways to improve my understanding of the land and its heritage." Sarah Beth's expression brightened with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. How wonderful! So few people appreciate the importance of understanding the stories that shaped a place. She moved toward a section near the back of the library, gesturing for him to follow. "We have several excellent accounts of early settlement patterns, and there's a fascinating collection of letters from some of the first ranching families." As she pulled volumes from the shelves, Clayton found himself drawn into another unexpected conversation. Sarah Beth's knowledge of local history was extensive, but more than that, she had a gift for bringing the past to life through vivid descriptions and carefully chosen anecdotes. She spoke of the hardships faced by early settlers, the conflicts between different groups competing for land, and the gradual evolution of communities like Harmony Creek, from rough frontier outposts to established towns. "Your own family must have fascinating stories," she said, settling into a chair near the window and indicating that he should do the same. "The Mackenzie name is legendary in these parts. 4 generations of successful ranching requires not just business acumen but deep understanding of the land itself." Clayton found himself sharing stories he rarely told, tales passed down from his grandfather about the early days of the ranch, the challenges of building a cattle empire in untamed territory, and the lessons learned through both triumph and failure. Sarah Beth listened with genuine interest, asking perceptive questions that revealed her quick understanding of both the practical and emotional aspects of his family's history. Your grandfather sounds like a man who understood that true success comes from respecting the land rather than simply exploiting it, she observed. That's a rare quality, even among those who make their living from the earth. He used to say that we were caretakers, not owners, Clayton replied, surprised to find himself sharing such personal philosophy with someone he'd known for barely a day, that each generation had an obligation to leave the land better than they found it. A noble principle. And do you feel you're living up to that obligation? The question was asked without judgment, but it struck Clayton with unexpected force. Was he honoring his grandfather's legacy? Certainly he'd increased the ranch's profitability and expanded its holdings. But lately, he'd begun to wonder if success measured purely in financial terms truly represented the kind of stewardship his grandfather had envisioned. I've been successful by most measures, he said carefully, but I sometimes wonder if I've focused too much on the business aspects and not enough on other considerations. Such as, Sarah Beth's gentle prompting encouraged him to voice thoughts he'd barely acknowledged to himself. Community, I suppose. My grandfather was deeply involved in territorial development, helping establish schools and supporting civic improvements. I've been more isolated. Isolation can be a luxury for those with sufficient resources, Sarah Beth said thoughtfully. But it can also become a prison, cutting us off from the very connections that give life meaning. Her words carried a weight that suggested personal experience, and Clayton found himself wondering about her own isolation. As the town's only librarian, living alone above the library with limited social connections due to both her disability and her modest circumstances, she might understand loneliness in ways that his wealth and status had never taught him. "Duto, you ever feel isolated?" he asked, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. "Forgive me, that was presumptuous." "Not at all. And yes, sometimes I do." Sarah Beth's honesty was refreshing after years of conversations carefully scripted to avoid any hint of personal difficulty. "But I've learned that true connection has less to do with the number of people around you and more to do with the quality of understanding you share with them." Clayton studied her face as she spoke, noting the quiet strength in her expression. Here was a woman who had faced significant challenges: the loss of her parents, a disability that limited her mobility, modest circumstances that restricted her social options, yet she spoke with a wisdom and serenity that put his own complaints about loneliness into perspective. "You seem to have found peace with your circumstances," he observed. "Peace, perhaps, but not resignation." Her smile held a hint of mischief. "There's a difference between accepting what you cannot change and settling for less than you deserve. Aunt Minerva taught me that a person's worth isn't determined by their limitations, but by how they choose to live within them." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several children, obviously just released from school and eager to exchange books or find new adventures among the shelves. Sarah Beth's demeanor with them was warm and patient, and Clayton watched with fascination as she helped a young boy struggling with reading find a book that matched both his interests and his ability level. "Miss Sarah Beth, will you read to us today?" asked a little girl with pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. "Of course, Mary. Shall we continue with Treasure Island?" As Sarah Beth gathered the children for their reading session, Clayton realized his time was up. Yet he found himself reluctant to leave this haven of books and genuine conversation to return to the formal obligations of his courtship. When Sarah Beth looked up from her young audience to bid him farewell, her smile held a warmth that stayed with him long after he'd left the library. That afternoon, as he rode through Harmony Creek's quiet streets, Clayton carried with him the memory of hazel eyes bright with intelligence and a voice that spoke of books as if they were treasured friends. The telegram arrived on Clayton's third morning in Harmony Creek, delivered by a breathless boy who'd ridden hard from the nearest Western Union office 20 miles away. Clayton recognized his mother's imperious style even before he broke the Wax seal, but the message's urgency surprised him. Clayton, stop Miss Ashford arriving Denver Friday, stop. Father expects immediate engagement. Stop your presence required no later than Saturday. Stop arrangements already made, stop. Mother Clayton read the telegram twice, his coffee growing cold as the implications settled over him like a winter fog. Miss Victoria Ashford, the Denver Railroad heiress who represented everything his family considered ideal in a potential bride. Beautiful, wealthy, connected to the right families, educated in the finest Eastern schools. She had been the subject of his mother's increasingly insistent correspondence for months, and apparently his prolonged absence had prompted direct action. Bad news, son? Pete Hawkins asked, looking up from his own breakfast at the boarding house where they'd taken rooms. Clayton folded the telegram and slipped it into his vest pocket. Family business. Mother wants me back in Denver by Saturday. That's a hard. Right from here. We'd need to leave today to make good time. Pete's weathered face showed concern. Something wrong at the ranch? No, nothing like that. Clayton pushed his plate away, his appetite suddenly gone. Mother has arranged for me to meet Miss Ashford, the railroad magnate's daughter I've mentioned. Pete nodded slowly, understanding passing between them without words. The suitable one, the eminently suitable one, according to Mother's letters. Clayton found himself thinking of Sarah Beth's observation about Elizabeth Whitworth being perfectly suitable, and wondered when that word had begun to sound like a curse rather than a compliment. And you're planning to go? Clayton considered the question. A week ago, the answer would have been automatic. His mother's expectations, combined with his own methodical approach to finding a bride, made Miss Ashford's suit the logical next step. She represented the culmination of his search, a woman who not only met every item on his carefully compiled list, but exceeded most of them. I should, he said finally. It's what's expected. Should and want ain't always the same thing. Pete observed, with the directness that had made him invaluable as both foreman and friend. You planning to finish your business here first? Clayton's business in Harmony Creek. Officially, that meant concluding his evaluation of Elizabeth Whitworth as a potential bride. She had certainly proven herself worthy of serious consideration, and the Whitworth family's expectations had grown increasingly obvious with each social invitation. A formal proposal would be welcomed, perhaps even anticipated. Yet Clayton found his thoughts turning not to Elizabeth's accomplishments or suitability, but to a conversation about poetry in a small library, and hazel eyes that lit with genuine passion when discussing books. Sarah Beth Williams had no place in his methodical search for a bride. She possessed none of the qualities his list demanded, offered none of the social or financial advantages his position required. She was, by every practical measure, entirely unsuitable. So why couldn't he stop thinking about her? I believe I should call on the Whitworths before leaving, Clayton said, rising from the table. It would be discourteous to depart without proper farewells. The Whitworth house seemed smaller in the morning light, its comfortable elegance somehow diminished. By comparison to the grand gestures awaiting him in Denver, Elizabeth received him in the same parlor where they'd first met, but this time her manner carried a subtle expectation that made the air feel heavy with unspoken obligations. How delightful to see you again, Mr. Mackenzie, she said, offering her hand with practiced grace. I was hoping we might have the opportunity for another conversation before you continued your travels. Mrs. Whitworth appeared with suspicious promptness, her smile carrying the particular satisfaction of a mother who sensed victory within reach. Mr. Mackenzie, how wonderful that you could call. Elizabeth and I were just discussing how much we've enjoyed your visit to our little town. The conversation that followed felt like a carefully choreographed dance, with both mother and daughter maneuvering toward an outcome that seemed increasingly inevitable. They spoke of his ranch with flattering interest, inquired about his family, with appropriate deference and made gentle observations about the benefits of establishing roots in a stable community. Elizabeth's accomplishments were displayed with subtle skill: her needlework, her musical abilities, her knowledge of domestic management. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding ranch life," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying just the right note of thoughtful consideration. "The challenges must be considerable, but I imagine the rewards of building something lasting would be very satisfying, especially with the right partner to share both the burdens and the joys." Clayton found himself studying her perfect features as she spoke, noting the way her words had been carefully chosen to suggest willingness to embrace his world while maintaining her own refined qualities. She was, he realized, offering herself as the ideal solution to his domestic needs. A woman who could manage his household, bear his children, and enhance his social standing while requiring nothing more complicated than security and status. In return, partnership is indeed essential to success in any enterprise, he replied, hearing the diplomatic distance in his own voice. "Elizabeth has always been so practical," Mrs. Whitworth interjected with motherly pride. "She understands that marriage, especially among people of quality, is built on shared values and mutual respect rather than more fleeting emotions." The words echoed his own long-held beliefs about marriage, yet hearing them spoken aloud made them sound somehow hollow. Had he really spent 3 years seeking a business partnership disguised as matrimony? When had he begun to value practical considerations over the possibility of genuine connection? "Fleeting emotions can certainly lead to poor decisions," Clayton agreed automatically, but even as he spoke, he found himself remembering Sarah Beth's passionate defense of poetry, the way her entire being had seemed to illuminate when discussing books she loved. "Exactly," Mrs. Whitworth beamed. "A marriage built on solid foundations will weather any storm, while one based on mere attraction or romantic fancy may crumble at the first real challenge." Elizabeth nodded in agreement, her manner suggesting a young woman who had given considerable thought to the practical aspects of marriage. "I believe that two people of similar background and values can develop deep affection over time, especially when they share common goals and mutual respect." Her words were perfectly reasonable, reflecting the wisdom of countless successful marriages among their social circle. Yet Clayton found himself wondering what it would be like to marry someone who already stirred deep affection, someone whose mere presence could transform an ordinary afternoon into something memorable. "Time certainly allows relationships to deepen," he said carefully, aware that his hosts were listening for signs of serious intent. When he finally took his leave, promising to write from Denver, Clayton carried with him the weight of expectations that seemed to grow heavier with each step. The Whitworths clearly anticipated a formal proposal in the near future. His mother expected him to honor his obligations to the Ashford family, and his own practical nature insisted that both women represented everything he should want in a wife. Yet as he walked toward the library for what might be his final visit, Clayton found himself hoping for something that defied every rational consideration. The sight of hazel eyes that could make him forget the careful calculations that had governed his adult life. The library felt different that afternoon, charged with an undercurrent of melancholy that Clayton couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was the knowledge that this might be his last visit, or perhaps it was the way Sarah Beth seemed to understand, without being told, that his time in Harmony Creek was drawing to a close. She moved about her duties with her usual quiet efficiency, but there was something in her manner, a careful distance, that hadn't been there before. "Leaving us soon, I expect," she said, without looking up from the book she was mending, her needle moving in precise stitches through the damaged binding. Small towns have a way of making such news travel quickly. Clayton settled into the chair he'd come to think of as his own, watching her skilled hands restore the worn volume to usefulness. "Tomorrow morning, most likely. Family obligations. Require my presence in Denver. Ah, yes, the suitable Miss Ashford. There was no mockery in her voice, only a kind of resigned understanding that made Clayton's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't identify. Elizabeth mentioned the family expectations during her visit yesterday. Clayton felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy at the thought of the two women discussing his situation. Miss Whitworth visited you? She comes by occasionally. To exchange books, though more often lately to discuss mutual acquaintances. Sarah Beth's choice of words was diplomatic, but Clayton caught the subtle implication. Elizabeth had been seeking information about his visits to the library, perhaps trying to understand what drew him here when he should have been focused on his courtship of her. And what did you tell her? The question escaped before Clayton. I could consider its propriety. For the first time that afternoon, Sarah Beth looked directly at him, her hazel eyes holding an expression he couldn't quite read. I told her that you seemed to have a genuine appreciation for literature and that our conversations about books had been most enlightening. She paused, her needle suspended above the book's spine. I also told her that a man's choice of reading material often reveals more about his character than his choice of formal entertainment. There was a weight to her words that suggested layers of meaning, and Clayton found himself leaning forward slightly. And what do you believe my reading choices reveal? Sarah Beth set down her mending and regarded him with the same thoughtful attention she might give to a particularly complex text. That you're a man seeking something more substantial than surface pleasures. The poetry you've chosen, the history that interests you, the questions you ask, they suggest someone hungry for deeper understanding, even if he's not entirely certain what he's trying to understand. Her assessment was so accurate, it left Clayton momentarily speechless. How had this woman, whom he'd known for barely 3 days, seen so clearly through the careful facade he'd maintained for years? Perhaps, he said carefully, I've been asking the wrong questions, perhaps. Or perhaps you've been asking the right questions but looking for answers in the wrong places. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of the library door opening, followed by footsteps that announced a visitor with more authority than Clayton had yet encountered. He turned to see a man of perhaps 40, well-dressed and carrying himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to respect. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his intelligent brown eyes took in the scene with quick assessment. Sarah Beth, forgive the interruption, the newcomer said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of education and social position. I wanted to return these medical journals and see if the shipment from Chicago had arrived. Dr. Webb, of course. Sarah Beth's manner brightened with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. Mr. McKenzie, allow me to introduce Dr. Marcus Webb, our town physician. Marcus, this is Mr. Clayton McKenzie, the rancher I mentioned. Clayton rose and extended his hand, immediately noting the firmness of the doctor's grip and the direct way he met his eyes. Dr. Webb was clearly a man accustomed to making quick, accurate assessments of character, a skill essential to his profession. Mr. McKenzie, a pleasure. I've heard a great deal about your visit to our community. Dr. Webb's smile was warm, but carried an undertone of evaluation that made Clayton feel as though he were being examined. I hope you've found Harmony Creek to your liking. Very much so, Clayton replied, aware that his response was being carefully noted. It's a remarkably pleasant town with exceptional people. Indeed it is. Dr. Webb's gaze moved between Clayton and Sarah Beth with an attention that suggested he was cataloging details for later consideration. Sarah Beth has been a particular asset to our community since returning from her aunt's care. Her dedication to the library has enriched all our lives immeasurably. There was something in the doctor's tone when he spoke of Sarah Beth, a warmth that went beyond professional. Appreciation to suggest deeper feelings. Clayton felt an unexpected surge of something that took him a moment to recognize as jealousy, followed immediately by the uncomfortable realization that he had no right to such emotions. Miss Williams has indeed been most helpful with my research, Clayton said, his voice perhaps more formal than the situation warranted. Marcus has been wonderfully supportive of the library's expansion, Sarah Beth said, moving to gather the medical journals the doctor had returned. His donations have allowed us to acquire several new collections, including some excellent works on natural history, a small investment in the community's intellectual welfare, Dr. Webb replied, but his eyes never left Sarah Beth's face as she spoke. Education and knowledge are the finest gifts we can offer future generations. Clayton watched the easy familiarity between the doctor and librarian, noting the way Dr. Webb anticipated Sarah Beth's needs and how naturally she accepted his assistance. Here was a man who clearly understood her worth, who saw past her physical limitations to appreciate her mind and character. More importantly, he was someone whose social position would make a relationship with Sarah Beth not just acceptable, but admirable. A respected professional choosing substance over superficial attractions. Dr. Webb has been particularly kind. Since Aunt Minerva's passing, Sarah Beth continued, apparently unaware of the undercurrents swirling around her. His guidance helped me navigate the legal complexities of the inheritance. Sarah Beth is far too modest about her capabilities, Dr. Webb said with obvious admiration. She managed those complexities with remarkable skill, though I was honored to offer whatever assistance I could. The doctor's visit stretched into a lengthy discussion of community affairs, during which Clayton found himself relegated to the role of observer. Dr. Webb spoke knowledgeably about topics ranging from municipal improvements to territorial politics, and Sarah Beth responded with insights that revealed her deep investment in Harmony Creek's welfare. They worked together with the easy coordination of people who had collaborated on numerous projects, and their mutual respect was evident in every exchange. As Clayton prepared to leave, Dr. Webb's parting words carried a subtle but unmistakable message. I hope your remaining time with us proves illuminating, Mr. McKenzie. Sometimes a brief visit can provide remarkable clarity about what truly matters. Walking back to the boarding house through Harmony Creek's quiet streets, Clayton carried with him the image of two people whose connection transcended the superficial considerations that had governed his own romantic pursuits. Dr. Webb represented everything Clayton had thought he wanted to be: successful, respected, and deeply rooted in community life. More troubling still, he represented everything Sarah Beth deserved in a husband. Clayton spent a restless night pacing the confines of his boarding house room, his packed bags standing ready by the door like silent sentinels guarding his departure. The telegram from his mother lay on the bedside table, its urgent summons growing more insistent with each reading. Miss Victoria Ashford, the Denver Railway fortune. A marriage that would unite two of the territory's most prominent families and secure the McKenzie legacy for generations to come. Everything he had been raised to want lay waiting in Denver, yet he found himself staring out at Harmony Creek's moonlit streets with the desperate longing of a man watching his last chance at happiness slip away. Somewhere in the small apartment above the library, Sarah Beth Williams was probably reading by lamplight, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders as she lost herself in whatever story had captured her imagination that evening. The image tortured him with its intimacy and its impossibility. At first light, Clayton made his way to the livery stable where Pete was already preparing their horses for the long ride north. The older man worked with his usual efficiency, but his weathered face wore an expression of concern that had become increasingly pronounced over the past few days. "You're making a mistake, son," Pete said without preamble as Clayton approached. "Seen you court a dozen suitable ladies over the past 3 years, and not one of them put that look in your eyes that you've been wearing since we got to this town." "What look would that be?" Clayton asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "The look of a man who's finally figured out what he's been searching for, just in time to walk away from it." Pete cinched his saddle with perhaps more force than necessary. That librarian gal's got something the others don't, and we both know it ain't about her circumstances or her suitability. Clayton couldn't deny the truth of Pete's observation, but acknowledging it only made his situation more painful. What would you have me do? Abandon my family obligations? Disgrace the Mackenzie name by pursuing a woman who offers nothing but what? Love? Genuine companionship? A partner who sees you for who you are instead of what you own? Pete's voice carried the exasperation of a man watching someone make a profound error in judgment. Your grandfather didn't build this ranch to trap his descendants in loveless marriages, boy. He built it to give them the freedom to choose happiness. You didn't know my grandfather, Clayton protested, but even as he spoke the words, he remembered stories that contradicted his assumption. Tales of Thomas Mackenzie's courtship of Margaret, of a man who had chosen love over a more advantageous match arranged by his own family. Didn't I? Pete's eyes held a glint that Clayton had never seen before. Who do you think hired me all them years ago? Who taught me everything I know about running a ranch and reading the character of men? Clayton stared at his foreman with dawning realization. You worked for my grandfather. Thomas Mackenzie saved my life when I was nothing but a drifter with more problems than prospects. Gave me work, taught me responsibility, and trusted me with his grandson's future. When your daddy passed on, Pete's voice softened with memory. He made me promise to help you become the man he knew you could be, not just the man others expected you to be. The revelation hit Clayton like a physical blow. Pete Hawkins wasn't just his foreman. He was his grandfather's legacy, a living connection to the man whose wisdom had built the Mackenzie fortune. And if Pete believed he was making a mistake, there's something else you need to know, Pete continued, reaching into his saddlebag to withdraw a familiar leather document case. Been carrying this for 20 years, waiting for the right moment to show it to you. Your grandfather made me swear not to reveal it unless you were fixing to make the same mistake he nearly made in his youth. Clayton accepted the document case with trembling hands, recognizing it as one of several that contained important ranch papers. But when he opened it, instead of deeds or contracts, he found a single sheet of parchment covered in his grandfather's distinctive handwriting. The document bore the official seal of the territorial court and was dated just 3 months before Thomas Mackenzie's death. Codicil to the last will and testament of Thomas Mackenzie. Clayton read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. Be it known that the inheritance of the Mackenzie Ranch and all its holdings shall pass to my grandson, Clayton McKenzie, upon the condition that he choose a life partner who possesses true nobility of character, regardless of station, and that said marriage be founded upon genuine affection and mutual respect rather than considerations of wealth or social position. Clayton's hands shook as he continued reading. Should said grandson enter into matrimony for reasons of family pressure, financial gain, or social advancement, the ranch shall instead be sold and the proceeds donated to the territorial education fund, as I believe that love and learning are the only true foundations upon which to build a lasting legacy. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as the implications became clear. Everything he thought he knew about his family obligations, every assumption that had driven his methodical search for a suitable bride, had been built upon a fundamental misunderstanding. His grandfather hadn't expected him to marry for status and advantage. He had specifically forbidden it. Why didn't you tell me this before? Clayton demanded, his voice rough with emotion. Because you weren't ready to hear it, Pete replied simply. Spent 3 years watching you try to convince yourself that duty and desire were the same thing. Figured you needed to learn the difference before you could understand what your grandfather was really trying to tell you. Clayton read the codicil, again noting the careful legal language that made its terms absolutely binding. The ranch, the cattle, the investments that had supported 4 generations of Mackenzies, all of it would be forfeit if he married without love. The irony was devastating. In seeking to preserve his family's legacy through a suitable marriage, he would actually destroy it. The Denver heiress, he said, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. Would cost you everything your grandfather built? Yes. Pete's voice was gentle but firm. Miss Ashford might be suitable by society's standards, but can you honestly say you love her, or that she loves you for anything beyond your wealth and position? Clayton thought of Victoria Ashford, a woman he'd never met but whose qualifications had been catalogued in his mother's letters with the precision of a business prospectus. Beautiful, accomplished, wealthy in her own right, and a complete stranger whose feelings toward him were entirely unknown and probably irrelevant to her family's matrimonial calculations. But if my grandfather felt this way about marriage, why didn't my parents? Your parents' marriage was arranged, true enough, but they were fortunate. Thomas saw genuine affection grow between them before the wedding ever took place. When he realized that not all arranged marriages would be so blessed, he wrote that codicil to protect you from making a choice you might regret forever. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their conversation. Clayton looked up to see Dr. Marcus Webb walking toward the livery stable, his medical bag in hand and his expression carrying the focused concern of a man responding to an emergency. Gentlemen, forgive me, Dr. Webb said, slightly out of breath. There's been an accident at the library. A shelf collapsed during the night, and Sarah Beth was injured trying to clear the debris. She's refusing to let me examine her properly, insisting she's fine, but Clayton was mounted and riding toward the library before Dr. Webb could finish. His sentence, Pete's revelations temporarily forgotten in the face of more immediate concerns. The thought of Sarah Beth, hurt and alone, stubbornly refusing help in the way he was beginning to understand, was characteristic of her fierce independence, filled him with a terror that had nothing to do with social propriety or family expectations. Behind him, he heard Pete's voice calling after him, "Now that's the look of a man who knows what matters." The codicil crinkled in Clayton's vest pocket as he rode, its words echoing in his mind like a benediction and a challenge. His grandfather had trusted him to choose love over duty, understanding over convention, genuine partnership over mere suitability. The question was whether Clayton had the courage to honor that trust, especially now that he finally understood what it truly meant to love someone whose worth couldn't be measured by society's narrow standards. Clayton burst through the library door to find chaos where order had once reigned. Books lay scattered across the floor like fallen leaves, their pages splayed open in positions that would have horrified any lover of literature. A tall oak bookshelf had indeed toppled during the night, its contents spilled in a wide arc that reached nearly to the circulation desk. In the midst of the destruction, Sarah Beth knelt on the floor, her walking stick forgotten, as she gathered damaged volumes with hands that trembled slightly despite her determined composure. "Sarah Beth!" Clayton dropped to his knees beside her, his hands hovering uncertainly as he took in the sight of a purple bruise blooming along her left temple and the way she favored her right arm. "Dr. Webb said you were hurt. You should be resting, not—" "I'm perfectly fine," she said firmly, though the slight waver in her voice belied her words. "Just a few bumps and bruises. Nothing that won't heal in a day or two." She continued gathering books with methodical determination, as if the simple act of restoring order could somehow minimize the extent of the disaster. Dr. Webb arrived moments later, slightly out of breath from his brisk walk. "Sarah Beth, I insist you let me examine that head injury properly. Concussions can be serious, and you were unconscious when Mrs. Patterson found you this morning." "I was not unconscious," Sarah Beth protested, finally looking up from her book rescue efforts. "I was simply resting my eyes while I planned how to manage this mess." Clayton caught Dr. Webb's eye and saw his own concern reflected there. Sarah Beth's stubborn independence, so admirable in most circumstances, was clearly working against her welfare in this situation. The librarian who had impressed him with her strength and wisdom looked suddenly fragile among the scattered remnants of her carefully ordered world. "What happened?" Clayton asked gently, settling more comfortably on the floor beside her and beginning to help gather the scattered volumes. "How did the shelf fall?" Sarah Beth's cheeks reddened slightly. I'm afraid it was my own fault. I've been acquiring new books faster than I could properly accommodate them, and I may have overcrowded the upper shelves. The weight distribution became unstable, and when I tried to retrieve a volume last night, the whole thing came down. Were you pinned beneath it? Dr. Webb asked, his professional concern evident as he knelt to examine the fallen shelf more closely. Only briefly. I managed to push most of it aside, though I'm afraid some of the books took the worst of it. Sarah Beth's voice carried a note of genuine distress as she held up a volume whose spine had been completely severed. Some of these were Aunt Minerva's favorites. I feel as though I've failed in my stewardship of her legacy. Clayton found himself moved by her obvious pain over the damaged books. Here was a woman who valued the written word so deeply that she mourned the injury to books as others might grieve for wounded friends. Without thinking, he reached out to cover her trembling hands with his own, offering what comfort he could. Books can be repaired, he said softly. What matters is that you weren't seriously hurt. The touch of his hands seemed to steady her, and for a moment they knelt there among the literary wreckage, connected by a shared understanding that transcended the formal boundaries that usually governed their interactions. Dr. Webb observed this exchange with thoughtful attention, his expression suggesting a man reassessing assumptions he'd previously held. "Let me help you to a chair," Clayton said, rising and offering Sarah Beth his arm. "Dr. Webb needs to examine your injuries properly, and this floor is no place for someone who's been through what you have." To his surprise, Sarah Beth accepted his assistance without protest, allowing him to help her to her feet and guide her to the comfortable reading chair near the window. Her acceptance of help, so contrary to her usual fierce independence, worried him more than her visible injuries. "Now then," Dr. Webb said, opening his medical bag with professional efficiency, "let me take a proper look at that head wound. Mr. McKenzie, perhaps you could continue organizing the books while I attend to my patient?" As Dr. Webb conducted his examination, Clayton found himself working alongside Pete, who had arrived shortly after the doctor and immediately begun the practical work of assessing the damage. The fallen shelf could be repaired, they determined, and most of the books were merely displaced rather than seriously damaged. Yet the sight of Sarah Beth's ordered sanctuary, reduced to chaos, stirred something protective in Clayton that had nothing to do with chivalrous duty and everything to do with genuine care for her well-being. "Mild concussion, as I suspected," Dr. Webb announced after completing his examination. "Nothing life-threatening, but you'll need rest and careful observation for the next 24 hours. I don't want you staying alone tonight, Sarah Beth." "Perhaps Mrs. Patterson could—" "I'll be fine here," Sarah Beth interrupted. "The library is my home, and I have no intention of abandoning it in its current state." "Sarah Beth," Dr. Webb's voice carried the gentle firmness of a man accustomed to dealing with difficult patients. "I must insist. Head injuries require proper supervision, and given your mobility challenges, it would be inadvisable for you to remain alone." Clayton watched as Sarah Beth's face tightened with the particular frustration of someone whose independence was being challenged by circumstances beyond her control. He understood suddenly that her refusal wasn't mere stubbornness, but a deep-seated fear of being seen as helpless or burdensome. "If I may," Clayton said carefully, "I could delay my departure for another day or two. Pete and I could help restore the library to order, and I could ensure that someone checks on Miss Williams regularly." Both Dr. Webb and Sarah Beth looked at him with surprise, though for different reasons. The doctor's expression suggested pleased approval of Clayton's practical solution, while Sarah Beth's face showed a complex mixture of gratitude and wariness. "That's very kind, Mr. McKenzie," she said slowly, "but surely your family obligations can wait another day." Clayton finished firmly, surprised by his own certainty. "Some things are more important than rigid schedules." As he spoke, Clayton felt the weight of his grandfather's codicil in his vest pocket, and understood that his decision to stay had implications far beyond helping with library repairs. He was choosing to follow his heart rather than his predetermined obligations, choosing to value genuine connection over social expectation. The telegram summoning him to Denver seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the sight of Sarah Beth's grateful smile. "I have to say," Dr. Webb observed, "that seems like an excellent solution. Mr. McKenzie, your assistance would be invaluable, and Sarah Beth, you'll have proper supervision without having to leave your beloved library." Over the next several hours, Clayton found himself working alongside both Dr. Webb and Pete to restore order to the library. The physical labor was satisfying in a way his usual ranch management duties rarely provided. There was something immediate and tangible about repairing the damaged shelf, sorting the scattered books, and gradually returning the space to its previous organized beauty. As they worked, Clayton observed the easy partnership that had developed between Sarah Beth and Dr. Webb over the years. The doctor anticipated her needs, understood her systems, and treated her with a respect that transcended mere professional courtesy. Yet Clayton also noticed that while Sarah Beth clearly valued Dr. Webb's friendship and appreciated his support, her interactions with him lacked the spark of genuine romantic feeling. "Marcus has been wonderfully helpful," Sarah Beth confided to Clayton during a moment when the doctor was examining the shelf's repair. "After Aunt Minerva died, I don't know how I would have managed without his guidance and friendship." "Friendship," Clayton repeated, noting her choice of words. "Oh yes, Marcus and I have known each other since childhood, and he's been like a protective older brother since I returned to Harmony Creek." Sarah Beth's voice held genuine affection, but none of the deeper emotion Clayton had hoped to detect. "He's been courting Miss Adelaide Hancock from the neighboring county for several months now. I believe he plans to propose soon," Clayton felt. A surge of relief so profound it surprised him with its intensity. Dr. Webb's obvious care for Sarah Beth was brotherly rather than romantic, which meant that Clayton's growing feelings for her weren't complicated by competition with a rival suitor. Yet this revelation also highlighted the precariousness of his own position. If a good man like Dr. Webb saw Sarah Beth as a dear friend rather than a potential wife, what did that say about Clayton's own romantic inclinations? As the afternoon wore on and the library gradually returned to order, Clayton found himself watching Sarah Beth with new eyes. Her grace under pressure, her genuine concern for others despite her own discomfort, her ability to find humor even in adversity, these qualities had nothing to do with the superficial characteristics that had dominated his previous romantic considerations, yet they stirred something in him that was far deeper and more lasting than mere attraction. When Dr. Webb finally departed, satisfied that Sarah Beth was in good hands and promising to check on her the following morning, Clayton found himself alone with the woman who had completely disrupted his carefully ordered world. The telegram from Denver lay forgotten in his room at the boarding house, as irrelevant as yesterday's weather compared to the immediate reality of Sarah Beth's grateful smile. "Thank you," she said simply, her hazel eyes reflecting the warm light of the afternoon sun streaming through the library windows. For staying, for helping, for understanding. Clayton realized that he was about to make the most important decision of his life. Not whether to marry for love or duty, but whether he had the courage to tell Sarah Beth how completely she had captured his heart. The library had never felt more intimate than it did in the gathering dusk of that October evening. Golden lamplight cast warm pools of illumination across the restored shelves, and the familiar scent of books mingled with the lingering fragrance of the tea Clayton had prepared for Sarah Beth, despite her protests that she was perfectly capable of managing such tasks herself. She sat curled in the reading chair near the window, a soft wool shawl draped around her shoulders and her walking stick propped nearby, a picture of quiet grace that made Clayton's chest tighten with emotions he was only beginning to understand. I still can't believe you postponed your journey for this, Sarah Beth said, gesturing around the now orderly library. Your family must be wondering what's become of you. Clayton settled into the chair opposite hers, cradling his own cup of tea, and studying her face in the lamplight. The bruise on her temple had darkened to a deep purple, but her eyes were bright and alert, showing no lingering effects from her concussion. Some things are more important than schedules, he said quietly, even when those schedules involve meetings with perfectly suitable young ladies from prominent Denver families. There was a note of gentle teasing in her voice, but Clayton caught the underlying current of something deeper, a careful probing that suggested she understood more about his situation than she let on. Especially then. The words escaped before. Clayton could consider their implications, carrying more weight than he'd intended. He saw Sarah Beth's eyes widen slightly at his vehement tone. Clayton. She set down her teacup with careful precision, and he noticed that she'd used his given name for the first time since they'd met. What exactly are you saying? The moment had arrived with the inevitable force of storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Clayton felt the weight of his grandfather's codicil in his vest pocket, the memory of Pete's revelations, and the accumulated wisdom of 3 days that had changed everything he thought he knew about love and marriage. But most of all, he felt the pull of Sarah Beth's hazel eyes and the realization that he could no longer pretend his feelings for her were anything less than transformative. I'm saying that 3 years of searching for the perfect wife, according to carefully compiled criteria, has taught me absolutely nothing about what I actually need in a partner. Clayton leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. I'm saying that a woman I've known for 3 days has shown me more genuine connection and understanding than all my suitable courtships combined. Sarah Beth's breath caught audibly. Clayton, you can't mean... Can't I? He rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, bringing himself to her eye level. Sarah Beth, I came to Harmony Creek with a list of 15 qualities that I believed would make the perfect wife. You don't meet a single one of those requirements, yet you possess something infinitely more valuable. The ability to see through pretense to the man underneath, to challenge me to be better than I am, to make me want to be worthy of the respect and affection you've shown me. Tears gathered in Sarah Beth's eyes, but she shook her head with the fierce determination he'd come to know so well. You don't understand what you're saying. I can't, Clayton, I'm not the kind of woman a man in your position marries. I have nothing to offer but intelligence that illuminates every conversation we share, but compassion that extends to every person you encounter, but strength that makes you rebuild a library single-handedly rather than ask for help you think you don't deserve. Clayton reached out to gently touch her hands, feeling their tremor beneath his fingers. Sarah Beth, you've made me realize that everything I thought I wanted was just a pale shadow of what I actually need. Your family will never accept me, she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. I'm a disabled librarian, with no dowry, no connections, no social graces that would complement your position. I walk with a stick, Clayton. I'll never be able to dance at the formal gatherings your world requires. I'll never be able to what? Make me happier than I've ever been in my life? Never be able to challenge me to think beyond the narrow confines of social expectation? Never be able to love me for who I am rather than what I own? Clayton's voice grew stronger with each word, his certainty crystallizing into something unshakable. Sarah Beth, you talk about what you can't offer, but you're the first person who's ever made me feel truly seen and valued for my mind and character rather than my bank account and bloodline. Sarah Beth looked into his eyes with an expression that combined hope and terror in equal measure. And what about Miss Ashford? Your mother's expectations? The life everyone assumes you'll choose? Clayton thought of the telegram waiting in his room, of his mother's plans and society's expectations. of all the carefully laid foundations for a life that would satisfy everyone except himself. Then he looked at Sarah Beth's face, luminous, with intelligence and marked by suffering that had only deepened her capacity for compassion, and felt a certainty that surprised him with its completeness. "Let me worry about my family's expectations," he said firmly. "The only expectation that matters now is whether you might possibly consider accepting the heart of a man who's just discovered what love actually means." Sarah Beth stared at Clayton for a long moment, her hazel eyes searching his face, as if trying to determine whether this extraordinary declaration could possibly be real. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of years of loneliness on both sides and the terrifying possibility that they might have found in each other what they'd never dared hope to discover. "You speak of love," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But Clayton, you've known me for 3 days. How can you be certain that what you feel isn't simply curiosity or pity or the romantic notion of rescuing someone from circumstances you perceive as unfortunate?" Clayton felt the question like a physical blow, not because it challenged his feelings, but because it revealed how deeply Sarah Beth had been wounded by a world that had taught her to see herself as an object of charity rather than affection. "Sarah Beth, look at me," he said gently, waiting until her eyes met his before continuing. "In 3 days, you've shown me more genuine understanding and intellectual partnership than I found in 3 years of formal courtships. What I feel for you isn't pity, it's recognition. Recognition of a kindred spirit, of someone whose mind challenges and delights me, of a woman whose strength makes my own seem pale by comparison. But the practical realities are that my grandfather left specific instructions about the kind of marriage that would honor his legacy." Clayton interrupted, pulling the codicil from his vest pocket and placing it in her hands. "Read it, Sarah Beth. Tell me what you think he would have said about a union based on genuine affection and mutual respect." Sarah Beth accepted the document with trembling fingers, her eyes widening as she read the carefully worded requirements that transformed Clayton's entire understanding of his family obligations. "True nobility of character, regardless of station," she read aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Genuine affection and mutual respect, rather than considerations of wealth or social position." "My grandfather understood something that it's taken me years to learn," Clayton said, settling back onto his heels while remaining close enough to touch her hands if she would allow it. "That a marriage built on superficial compatibility might preserve social status, but only a union of hearts and minds can create a lasting legacy worth preserving." "And you believe that's what we could have?" Sarah Beth's question carried a note of wonder, as if she were beginning to allow herself to hope for something she'd thought impossible. "I believe we already have the foundation for it," Clayton replied with growing confidence. "Our conversations about literature have revealed minds that complement and challenge each other. Our discussions of philosophy and life have shown values that align in all the ways that matter. The ease with which we've worked together today, the way you've trusted me with your vulnerability, and I've found myself sharing thoughts I've never voiced to anyone. Sarah Beth, what more could we need to build a life together?" Tears spilled over Sarah Beth's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. "I never allowed myself to imagine, when I saw you with Elizabeth, so perfectly matched in all the ways the world values, you thought I was another man seeking a ornamental wife to complete his social standing," Clayton finished gently. "And you weren't wrong. That's exactly what I thought I was doing. Until I met a librarian who made me realize that I'd been looking for companionship in all the wrong places." Sarah Beth reached up to touch his face with fingers that no longer trembled, her touch soft but sure. "And when your mother meets me, when society sees you've chosen a disabled woman with no fortune or family connections to recommend her, then they'll see a man who finally learned the difference between what he thought he should want and what actually makes him happy," Clayton said, leaning into her touch. "Sarah Beth, I won't pretend the path will be easy. There will be gossip, disapproval, probably some family resistance at first. But I've spent 3 years trying to please everyone except myself, and I refuse to sacrifice the possibility of genuine happiness for the comfort of social approval. And if I said yes?" Sarah Beth's voice carried the breathless quality of someone standing at the edge of a precipice, ready to take a leap of faith that would change everything. "If I agreed to marry you despite all the practical objections and social obstacles." Clayton felt his heart soar with a joy so profound it left him momentarily speechless. "If you said yes," he managed finally, "I would spend every day of our life together, proving that you made the right choice. I would love you with the devotion you deserve, support your independence while offering partnership, and build with you the kind of marriage my grandfather envisioned, one based on genuine affection, mutual respect, and the recognition that true worth has nothing to do with society's arbitrary measures." Sarah Beth smiled through her tears, her entire being luminous with joy and decision. "Then yes, Clayton McKenzie. Yes, I'll marry you, and together we'll show the world what love looks like when it's based on truth rather than convenience." As Clayton leaned forward to seal their engagement with a kiss that tasted of tears and hope, and the promise of a future built on genuine understanding, the library around them seemed to glow with the warmth of a love story that would prove more enduring than any of the tales contained within its walls. 2 years had passed since that October evening in the Harmony Creek Library, when Clayton McKenzie discovered that love couldn't be found through careful lists and calculated courtships. As he stood on the wraparound porch of the ranch house that had once echoed with emptiness, watching his pregnant wife tend to the flower garden she'd planted in their first spring together, he marveled at how completely his life had been transformed by choosing his heart over his head. The McKenzie ranch still stretched across 20,000 acres of Wyoming's finest grassland, but it had become something more than a successful business enterprise. Under Sarah Beth's gentle influence, it had evolved into a true community center. The bunkhouse now included a small library where ranch hands could improve their reading skills during long winter evenings. The main house regularly hosted educational gatherings where local families could discuss everything from agricultural innovations to territorial politics. Most importantly, Sarah Beth had established a school for the children of ranch workers and neighboring homesteaders, believing that education was the greatest gift they could offer the next generation. "You're watching me again," Sarah Beth called from the garden, her voice carrying the amused affection that had become the soundtrack of their marriage. She straightened carefully, one hand supporting her lower back as her pregnancy entered its final months, and smiled at her husband with the radiant happiness that still took his breath away. "Can you blame me?" Clayton replied, descending the porch steps to join her among the roses and wildflowers that now softened the formerly austere landscape around the house. "Every morning I wake up amazed that you're actually here, that this life we've built together is real." Sarah Beth laughed, the sound like music in the warm summer air. 2 years of marriage, and you still sound surprised that I didn't change my mind and run away with a more suitable gentleman. There are no more suitable gentlemen, Clayton said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his hands on the gentle swell of their child. "Turns out my grandfather was right. Suitability is a poor substitute for genuine partnership." The journey to this contentment hadn't been without its challenges. Clayton's mother had indeed been horrified by his choice, arriving at the ranch 3 weeks after their hasty wedding with a mixture of fury and disbelief that her carefully laid plans had been so thoroughly disrupted. The meeting between Margaret McKenzie and her new daughter-in-law had been tense at first, with the older woman clearly struggling to reconcile her expectations with the reality of Sarah Beth's intelligence, grace, and obvious devotion to her. It had been Sarah Beth herself who'd finally bridged the gap, not through any attempt to prove her worthiness, but simply by being herself, knowledgeable about ranch management, genuinely interested in family history, and possessed of the kind of quiet strength that reminded Margaret of her own younger self. The turning point had come when Sarah Beth had shown Margaret the library she was establishing and spoken passionately about the importance of education in building stronger communities. Clayton's mother, herself a woman of considerable intelligence, who had sometimes felt constrained by social expectations, had recognized a kindred spirit and gradually warmed to her unconventional daughter-in-law. "Your mother's latest letter arrived yesterday," Sarah Beth said, leaning back against Clayton's chest and enjoying the solid warmth of his embrace. "She's beside herself with excitement about becoming a grandmother and has already ordered enough. Baby clothes to outfit triplets. She's making up for lost time," Clayton observed with gentle humor. "I think she's finally realized that happiness might be more important than social standing." The rest of Harmony Creek had adjusted to the Mackenzie marriage with varying degrees of acceptance and curiosity. Elizabeth Whitworth had married a banker from Cheyenne within 6 months of Clayton's engagement to Sarah Beth, a union that satisfied everyone's expectations for appropriateness while apparently providing genuine contentment for both parties. Dr. Marcus Webb had indeed proposed to Miss Adelaide Hancock and established a thriving practice that served 3 counties. The town had prospered under the combination of Clayton's business investments and Sarah Beth's educational initiatives, creating a community that valued both material success and intellectual growth. "Pete thinks the baby will be a boy," Sarah Beth said, shifting slightly to ease the discomfort of her condition. "He's already planning riding lessons and cattle management tutorials." "Pete's been planning this child's education since the day we announced our engagement," Clayton laughed. "I think he sees it as his chance to shape another generation of Mackenzies according to grandfather's principles." As if summoned by their conversation, Pete Hawkins appeared around the corner of the house, his weathered face wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "Clayton, Sarah Beth, you need to come see this. Got a telegram from Denver that's going to make your day." They followed the old foreman to the front porch, where he handed Clayton an official-looking document that bore the territorial seal. Clayton read it aloud, his voice growing stronger with each word. "The Territorial Education Committee is pleased to announce that the Mackenzie Ranch School has been selected as a model institution for rural education. Sarah Beth Mackenzie is hereby appointed as Regional Education Advisor, with responsibility for establishing similar programs throughout Wyoming Territory." Sarah Beth's gasp of surprise and delight was everything Clayton could have hoped for. "They want me to help other communities establish schools, to share what we've learned here? Looks like your grandfather's legacy is spreading beyond just this ranch," Pete observed with satisfaction. Education and love, turned out those were the only investments that really mattered. As the sun set over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that matched the happiness in Clayton's heart, he reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A man who had once sought love through systematic evaluation and careful calculation had instead found it in the most unexpected place, in the mind and heart of a woman whose worth couldn't be measured by society's shallow standards. Their child kicked vigorously, as if eager to join a world where love was valued over convention and where 2 people who had once felt isolated in their individual circumstances had found in each other the perfect partner for building a life of meaning. "Enjoy," Clayton smiled, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, just as his grandfather had always intended.